Hi, on this episode of Citizens Academy, we're going to be talking about debt, specifically municipal debt and the city's municipal debt portfolio, so you can understand exactly what we've been obligated to and how we intend to pay for it. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of municipal debt that are available to cities to issue for projects and other city needs. The first of these, of course, is general obligation debt, otherwise known as GO debt. General obligation debt is backed by the full faith and credit of the city. What does that mean? Well, full faith means that the city is basically promising to make good on its outstanding debt obligations. Full credit means that the city will raise revenues to the extent that it needs to pay for its obligations. So in other words, the city has promised to make good on its debt and agrees that it will raise money to levels that it needs in order to make that payment back. The city will not default on its debt obligations, is basically what it amounts to. So, for our purposes, general obligation debt means that the city will raise property taxes or another form of taxation or any form of revenue really to make sure that whatever debt obligation it has to pay in that year is paid in full. The payment of general obligation debt is very consistent. Cities throughout the country pay their general obligation debt like clockwork every year. In rare occasions, there are cases where cities have defaulted on their general obligation debt, but this was largely because of unforeseen economic conditions like the Great Recession of 2008 that led to situations where cities didn't have enough money to come in to pay those debt obligations. In the state of Kansas, municipalities have nearly a perfect track record when it comes to municipal general obligation debt payment. I'm sure there's a case or two out there where cities in Kansas did not make good on their payments, but from what I know, it's almost 100% cities making good on their general obligation payments. In fact, if you're an investor and you buy municipal debt, you know that second to the federal and state governments, municipalities are great investment tools because you're going to get your principal and your interest back as planned. So, as I've mentioned, general obligation debt is backed by the full faith and credit of the city and is payable with various revenue sources. In our case, general taxes, which could mean property taxes. It could also mean sales taxes or other taxes that the city raises. It also could mean special assessments. Oftentimes, the city will do a development and participate in the infrastructure costs associated with that development. By doing so, issuing general obligation debt allows the developer to take advantage of lower interest rates that a municipality can secure while paying those back through special assessments that are assessed against benefiting properties, largely within the benefit district or within the development. In other words, the development raises the revenue to pay back the bonds, so the city is not on the hook for those obligations. Except, of course, when it is, in which case the development probably went bankrupt or did not sell the units as it had originally planned. Remember, if it's general obligation debt, the city is obligated to make those payments, whether the developer is available or not. And then, of course, the city has other revenue that it can use to pay general obligation debt. Generally, this is any other source of revenue that the city has access to. This could be water rates, sewer rates, it could even mean trash rates. And depending on the bond issuance, the projects that were financed, and the revenue that was pledged to pay them back, it could be a combination of all of these things. Because general obligation bonds are backed by the full faith and credit of the city, it also has the lowest interest rate available to the city on the open market. On average, the city's general obligation bonds that are outstanding have an interest rate anywhere between 3 and 3.5%. That's pretty good because you can't go to the bank and borrow money for cheaper than that. General obligation debt is the most secure and consistent debt that the city has. It's also one of the most versatile debt instruments that we have available to help finance the city's ongoing needs. The next form of debt that the cities have access to, financing projects, is revenue bonds. Revenue bonds are backed by utility revenues that are based on the type of project that is being financed with the bonds. So in other words, if we do a water revenue bond, we're going to pay that project back with water revenues. Why? Well, it's because we're using the water revenue bonds to build and finance water projects. We can also do sewer revenue bonds. We can really do any kind of revenue bonds for any type of utility that generates its own revenue source. In essence, what the city's doing is it's pledging the revenues from that utility to pay back the bonds. Revenue bonds, because they are backed by utility revenues, are going to have a slightly higher interest rate than general obligation bonds. So if you'll remember, I mentioned that the city's average rate was about 3 to 3.5%. A revenue bond would be a little bit higher, maybe on the line of 3.5 to 4.5%, depending on the issuance and when it was issued and the consistency or stability of those utility revenues. So now you can kind of understand that when the city has a project, for example, even if it's a water or sewer project, we still want to utilize our general obligation debt to finance those projects because it saves a considerable amount of money on interest. Lastly, down here at the bottom, we have revolving loans. Revolving loans are going to be infrastructure loans that are offered by the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, KDHE. Revolving loans are, in essence, the city borrowing from state-designated funds that have been set aside for infrastructure projects. In many cases, they carry a very, very low interest rate that's competitive, or in some cases, even a little bit lower than the city's general obligation bonds. And that's because it's the state of Kansas's general obligation, if you will, that is backing those loans. Of course, the city has to put up a little bit of collateral and make sure that we have sufficient revenues to pay back those loans, but it is another way of financing water and sewer infrastructure costs. I believe the city has right now 1 or 2 outstanding revolving loan funds, and the current rate is about 2.5%. So pretty good money for the price. So in essence, those are the different types of debt we have. There are a few others that are a little more complicated than that. The important thing to note is that the city, for the most part, issues its general obligation bonds when it needs to finance projects. And the main reason for that is because it has a lower interest rate and allows the city to save taxpayer dollars. Now that I've talked about the different types of debt the city has available to finance projects, let's take a deeper look at the city's current debt portfolio so we can understand how the city uses debt to finance projects. Right behind me is a chart that is basically a summary of the city's debt portfolio. The first thing at the top is the statutory debt limit of $35.3 million. By state law, the city can only issue so much general obligation debt. In fact, that is 20% of the city's assessed valuation at that year in question. Presently, $35.3 million. And right now, the city has $8.2 million in general obligation debt that counts against this limit. That's all well and good because, as you can see, there's quite a gap between our debt limit and the amount of money that we have that counts against our debt limit. But then if we go to the next line, you'll notice that the total general obligation debt is currently standing at $23.5 million. And you might say, well, wait, that's bigger than $8.2 million and it's almost $35.3 million. What gives? Well, the answer is this. State law, the state law that defines the statutory debt limit, provides several exceptions to the statutory debt limit rule. This means that there's a lot of debt that is general obligation debt that doesn't count against the statutory debt limit. For example, the city utilizes its general obligation debt to finance water and sewer projects. Any debt that's backed by revenues from utilities do not count against the statutory debt limit. The city also issues general obligation debt to finance development costs associated with infrastructure to open new land up for residential development. These development costs, or rather this debt, is repaid with special assessments. Any debt that's repaid with special assessments is also exempt from the state's statutory debt limit. So there's a lot of carve-outs whereby a lot of debt the city issues doesn't count against the statutory debt limit. So we still have quite a bit of capacity. In fact, approximately $27 million of statutory debt capacity left in the tank. This is a good thing because it gives the city plenty of flexibility to do various projects that it may need that are not necessarily backed by utility revenues or even special assessments. As we transition below the total general obligation line, we can see how our current obligation of $23.5 million is broken out by various funds. The first of these funds is the Bond and Interest Fund, which is currently on the hook for $15.7 million. The Bond and Interest Fund is the fund whereby the city, if the city has a development project, we will pay those debt obligations from the Bond and Interest Fund. Oftentimes, we'll have special assessments that go along with that, but the city will also have some at-large costs that the city has to pay as a result of the project as well. These costs are largely dictated by city policy and practice. The Bond and Interest Fund is also where the city finances various other projects that are not necessarily paid for from utility revenues or special assessments, but that may require a general property tax increase. For example, if the city were to build a new police department, because the police department doesn't generate its own revenues, that would likely be funded from property taxes, which would be covered in the Bond and Interest Fund. As I mentioned, the Bond and Interest Fund currently has $15.7 million in outstanding general obligations that we pay for. The Sewer Fund is next in line with $4.2 million of general obligation debt, followed by the Water Fund at $3.1 million. Both the Water and the Sewer Fund pay their general obligations using revenues from their operations. So in other words, sewer revenues or sewer rates that sewer customers pay, as well as water rates that water customers pay, both go toward paying the debt service associated with those projects. Finally, we have a very small amount, $500,000, which is from other funds. This includes debt that was issued on behalf of the airport, the library, and other general projects that the city is now repaying. But again, it's only $500,000. On an annual basis, the city is currently paying about $6 million in debt service to pay down this $23.5 million. Again, these dollars are coming from property taxes, they're coming from special assessments, they're coming from water and sewer rates, they're coming from a whole host of various revenues that are collected by the city and then used to pay this debt obligation. Much of our obligations are extended for 10 years, although the city has had a practice of extending debt for 20 years, especially for development, to reduce the annual cost on those properties, but extending it over a longer period of time. Lastly, I'd like to briefly talk about lake obligations, which is shown right here in the bottom of the summary chart at $39.2 million. Now you might note very quickly that $39.2 million is greater than our statutory debt limit of $35.3 million. It's also greater than the $23.5 million of total general outstanding obligations. What gives on that? The $39.2 million represents the city's total obligation that it owes the federal government for its portion of construction costs related to El Dorado Lake. Presently, the city is not paying any principal or interest on the $39.2 million. The reason is the $39.2 million is outstanding on lake storage space that the city is presently not using. In other words, this represents storage space that the city will eventually use in the future. When the city activates that space and begins to use that water, the United States Army Corps of Engineers will activate it, and we will then at that point begin paying our debt on the $39.2 million. There is some good news, though, with respect to our lake obligations. A couple of years ago, our outstanding lake debt obligation was $57.5 million. Not only was it $57.5 million, but over the life of the obligation, which extends out to 2081, the city would have been on the hook to pay over $400 million in lake debt obligations. $39.2 million sounds like a lot of money, and of course it is, but a few years ago, that number was actually $57.5 million. and it would have increased to over $400 million in principal payments through the life of the contract, which extends out to 2081. That means that if the city wouldn't have activated that space until the very end of 2081, we would have owed $400 million. But the City Commission negotiated with Washington and got an amendment to our contract that reduced the principal amount from $57.5 million down to $39.2 million, a significant decrease. Not only that, but we also were able to cap the total amount that it could increase to into the future. So now instead of $400 million, it can only increase to about $72 million. Still a big number, but much smaller than it could have been if we hadn't have made those changes. Again, lake obligations are outstanding. The city is presently not making those payments because they're based on future water storage space. However, the city's water fund currently brings in enough money to set aside about $360,000 a year into our sinking fund for future payment of principal and interest when we activate future water storage space. Lake debt is pretty complicated, but for now, you just need to know that the $39.2 million doesn't count as far as our statutory debt limit, nor will it ever, because it's a contract directly with the federal government, which of course is exempt by the statutory debt limit, and secondarily is not included in the total general obligation debt that's outstanding now. The city does have a plan to pay this back, and perhaps we'll go into that at another video at another time. Well, I hope this video helps you understand a little bit more about municipal debt, as well as the city's outstanding obligations and how we intend to repay them. The city uses municipal debt to finance projects and to make sure that we have the facilities in place needed to serve our community today, as well as to help our community grow and meet future needs. We'll see you next time on Citizens Academy.